I'm Mayor Bill McLeod, and I want to welcome you all to our program today. The Village of Hoffman Estates, we still remember 18 years later. It's nice to see so many of you here. You know, the village has made a commitment that we'll remember this day, and we'll just keep on remembering because it's something that people need to remember. And we have a whole generation of people who have no direct knowledge of this. It's just an item in the history book, and we need to show what this day meant to America, how it brought us all together. Hopefully, we'll all get together again without some tragedy like this. I'm very pleased that Captain Schneidwin from the Schaumburg Fire Department is once again making his presentation. It's been a tough time for the Schneidwins with the loss of his beloved father, and his mother's here also, and his wife, and it's really great, and we really appreciate you're going through such an emotional experience just doing this after the loss of your dad. At this time, the Honor Guard of Fire and Police will present the colors.
Right, turn, detail, hold, prepare to post colors. Ready? Post. Recover. Freeze and hold.
Everybody, please join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Order. Hold. Left. Pace. Art time. Art. Forward. March.
Thank you, gentlemen. You can all be seated now. I'd like to introduce some of your elected people here today. I know we have Trustee Mike Gatiss here, Trustee Karen Mills, Trustee Gary Stanton, Trustee Anna Newell, of course our Clerk Bev Romanoff, whose commission puts on this presentation, and our State Representative Fred Crespo is also here. Fred's a retired Hoffman Estates trustee, moved on to Springfield. Now it's my very great pleasure to introduce Captain John Schneidwin to say a few words about his dad and make his presentation. Captain?
Good evening. Well, we said we would remember, and you're all here today. Thank you. Tonight, I dedicate this talk to my father. We lost him just 13 days ago. He was my hero, and he taught me about life, toughness, sacrifice, and public service. He served in the fire service for 43 years. If he were alive today, he'd be in the front row, rooting me on. He inspired me to go to 9/11 and cheered me up when times got tough. His impact on me cannot be overstated, and I miss him dearly. 18 years ago, I never thought I would plan a trip to New York specifically to visit a museum dedicated to nearly 3,000 people who would be killed in a matter of 102 minutes. Bridget and I will pay our respects Saturday. Somehow, New York has managed to create a museum that offers peace, tributes, and even a feeling of chaos of the morning of the attacks. The human impact, rescues. Although very few people survived the collapse, the greatest rescue effort ever mounted occurred on 9/11. Some estimate that 20,000 lives were saved. The rescue effort forged by the FDNY highlighted the sacrifices made by 343 firefighters that were killed that day. They went in knowing their chances to survive were risky. The number 343 will always symbolize sacrifice and heroism. 2,996 people were killed in the attacks, including the 343 firefighters. 23 New York City police officers were killed. 37 Port Authority officers were killed. 6,000 people were injured. Only 258 units of blood were needed that week, although thousands of pints of blood were donated. 291 bodies were only found intact. Just last week, the remains of firefighter Michael Hobb were identified 18 years after the attack. Astonishingly, 1,700 families still have no remains for their loved ones. We continue to die from the after effects of the attack. Many of my colleagues are fighting cancer. 50 cancers have been related to the site. So many have died since the attack that a memorial has been erected in New Jersey. So far, nearly 2,000 firefighter, police, rescue workers have been added to the memorial. Sadly, the planners have left ample room for more names. For me and our group, we have all fared well in terms of health. Some of us have been diagnosed with respiratory or GI issues, but no cancers as of yet. Many who join me in the rescue effort are adjusting to a new type of life, one with grandchildren. My story began with a phone call from my then boss, Lieutenant Rick Colomay. He actually asked me to work for him while he went, but I asked if they had room for 2 more men, me and Fireman Butch Adams. Rick worked out the numbers and told us we would leave at 4 a.m. I hung up the phone and called my 2 closest confidants, my parents. My mom responded with, "I'm not sure you should go. You should talk to your father." And Dad, a retired chief from the Chicago Fire Department, and again, my lifelong hero, said, "That's great. When do you leave?" I had a large problem, though. My children did not yet know of my decision. I asked their mother if she would bring them by the firehouse so I could tell them of my decision. Johnny, then 9, and Katie, then 7, were aware of the attacks but had no idea I had chosen to go to Ground Zero. Their reaction was heart-wrenching as they asked why I had to go and when I would be returning. They left the firehouse with a tearful goodbye, and that was the start of the emotional roller coaster. At 4:30 a.m., we started our journey to Ground Zero. We had a short stop at the Chicago Fire Academy to load up on supplies, and then our ragtag caravan made its way out of the city. Our group consisted of volunteers in their own vehicles. We had vans, explorers, even a mobile home. And every vehicle included a homemade sign saying Fire Department, Destination NYC. Our trip included several police escorts through Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. As we drove, other vehicles waved and gave us the thumbs up. People at rest stops and gas stations encouraged us, said they would pray for us, and even paid for some of our meals. The ride was long, and the anticipation of what to expect kept increasing. The radio continued to give approximate numbers of fatalities. The numbers went up with every report, as high as 25,000 on our last report. As we entered New York City, it really hit me. I saw the huge plume of smoke that consumed lower Manhattan. We made our way across the George Washington Bridge and into Manhattan. It was there that we met Paul from Spot News from here in Chicago. Paul prepared us to expect a gruesome scene with body parts all over. We parked the vehicles and proceeded to the Trade Center. The remaining shell of the World Trade Center looked like the Roman Colosseum to me. As we met a chief from the FDNY, he said, "Welcome to hell." And he was right. I was unprepared for the destruction we had in front of us. The fires were still burning. Twisted steel was blocking the streets. A choking dust cloud was everywhere. The wreckage did not resemble a building. I remember standing in front of the rubble pile and saying it's about 80 feet high, yet each tower stood over 1,200 feet. As we searched the next 5 days, we worked in many areas of the site. We were on top of the pile searching, digging with our hands, tunneling under the buildings, or manning hose lines to extinguish the fires, and we were part of the famous bucket brigade. We filled 5-gallon buckets up with pieces of concrete and twisted pieces of steel. We worked in concert with the heavy machine operators who would cut and move huge pieces of steel. It was truly amazing. The towers were cities unto themselves, filled with people, furniture, and equipment, yet we could not locate any people. Nothing resembled a desk, chair, computer, or file cabinet. Everything was pulverized into powder, concrete, and steel. I wondered where all the people were. Were they trapped in void spaces? Surely we believed that some people had survived, or at least that's what we told ourselves. Yet with each void space that we found, it just led to more disappointment. No survivors. As I searched, I thought about the victims, typical people at work, yet they faced a life and death race to get out of the buildings. The destruction left little doubt that survival would take a miracle. As we searched, we did find personal belongings in the rubble: hats, luggage, shoes, shirts, aprons, boots, and gloves. With each boot or glove we found, we had the gruesome task of searching inside for any remains. We found checkbooks and wallets and pictures of families and children. Papers littered the site. We also found equipment buried in the collapse: crushed cars, fire department vehicles, doors of fire engines, saws and hose fittings used to fight the fire before the fatal collapse. This was both inspiring and emotional. Pride. We knew we were representing Chicago, our fire departments, our hometowns, and all of our fellow firefighters who, if given the opportunity, would have gladly joined us. We worked right alongside the FDNY firefighters, urban search and rescue teams, and search dogs. We would clear a path, and the dogs would enter the holes and search with their noses. At one point during our search, we heard everyone on the pile say, "Quiet, the dogs had found something." Suddenly, to our amazement, 4 firemen were pulled from the pile. The entire site began to chant, "USA, USA." It was exhilarating. We all worked harder, filling our buckets and passing them back as quickly as possible. It seemed like we were all ants working together. Later, we learned the men that were rescued had become trapped earlier in that day and were not part of the original collapse. The site was dangerous. Sharp pieces of concrete and steel made walking and working tricky. Some of the steel beams were hot from the fires burning beneath the rubble pile. The buildings next to the site were heavily damaged and constantly being evaluated for the possibility of collapse. At one point, Lieutenant Colomé and a few of the Chicago guys took a break near the harbor. Almost as soon as they arrived at the harbor, there was a mass evacuation of the site, as a secondary collapse had occurred. Huge panes of glass and chunks of concrete began to rain down. An evacuation was ordered, and Lieutenant Colomé and his group were shoved onto a boat. Rick pleaded with the boat captain to let him off. He was certain that Butch and I were in the collapse, and he felt responsible. The boat left New York and docked in New Jersey. He was frantic, wanting to know if we were alive. Rick was evaluated by a medical staff, who quickly started 2 IVs as he was suffering from dehydration and other injuries. Rick pleaded with the medical staff to let him go back. He finally made contact with a command officer in our area who confirmed that we were not in the collapse. This was just one example of the dangers we faced during our stay. In the chaos in a moment, Rick lost his fire coat, and we never did find it. It took 15 years for Rick to tell me the whole story. Our days were spent either working at the site or back at our campground. We set up camp at a school at the corner of Greenwich and Chambers. From the second-floor libraries, the collapsed buildings were clearly visible. The school was first used as a triage center for the injured, and later a depot center for clothing and equipment after it was determined there would be very few injured people. The school had no running water or power, and a sign on the bathroom door read, "For the love of God, please do not use this bathroom." We slept on sidewalks and school desks between our shifts at Ground Zero. So many stories are so difficult to recall, as so many things were happening so quickly and simultaneously. A group of us, including Lieutenant Colomé, Butch, and myself, were sent to search under World Trade Center Building Number 5. I will never forget being tied off to that rope and snaking under the collapsed building and hearing the steel creak and settle. We knew the possibility of being killed by a secondary collapse, but at least we thought it would be quick. As we returned that night, we saw the refrigerator trucks being filled with with plastic bags containing some of the 19,000 body parts. It was really an unbelievable sight. The school was a place that centered me. The first couple days, our group would have planning meetings on the second-floor auditorium. The school was hot and the doors were propped open. As I looked down, I noticed that the doors were propped open using one of my kids' favorite books, Chicka Chicka Boom Boom. And that was a sight that brought me back to the reality of the ordeal. This was not just a collapsed building, twisted steel, and crushed concrete. It was an American treasure with real people missing. The World Trade Center represented America and the people who worked there. It was their home away from home, and they had children and loved ones who wanted them to come home from work. Back at our camp, we spent time between our shifts talking about our families, our job, and the overall effect this would have on the job of a fireman, and the possibility of war. Unsure what the final number of dead would be, we knew the firefighting family took a big hit. We talked to FDNY firemen who shared stories of their friends who weren't supposed to be working but traded a day to help a buddy, or who were detailed and sent to a different firehouse and now they were missing, or the guys who came in volunteering and they were killed, or the guy who was set to retire and this was his last week, or the new guy whose first fire turned out to be the World Trade Center and now they were missing. Retired fathers were searching for their missing sons. Brothers were looking for their missing brothers. The horror of the day was far-reaching. A proud ritual of the FDNY was displayed. When a fireman's body was discovered, only members of his company were allowed to move him, while all others saluted the flag-draped Stokes basket. Often, it was just the fire gear that identified the body. Each of us had our moments where emotions got the best of us. For some, it came with the pictures we found. With others, it was the notes from the families or the frustration of not finding survivors. Some were saddened by our loss of innocence. All of us were affected by the unbelievable amount of people still missing. Communication was a problem for us at Ground Zero. We had very little information from the outside world. As a matter of fact, the best information came from my parents and other family members. I would call daily and they would say, "Wear a mask. There's asbestos at Ground Zero." Or they have bomb threats on the bridges and at the Empire State Building. The city was so overwhelmed with grief that spreading the word about other dangers to everyone on the scene was a daunting task. Our families paid the price for us being gone, with constant worry about the risks we faced and the unpredictable length of our stay. Each day, the kids would painfully ask, "When are you coming home?" What made a lasting impact on me, aside from the site, were the volunteers. They were simply amazing. You could not walk outside the site without somebody saying, "How about some water? Stay hydrated. Do you need your eyes flushed? Are you hungry? How are you feeling?" And everyone said, "Thank you for coming." At times, people would cheer us as we walked down the street. People encouraged us, fed us, and gave us fresh clothes. They prayed for us, and we prayed for them. As the week went on, we received word that they opened up the showers at the high school. We were covered in dust, smoke, grime, and sweat. We climbed the stairs to the second-floor showers under the glow of temporary lighting. Volunteers handed us soap and towels and ushered us into the cold showers. Washing away the grime was cleansing in more than one way. The volunteers would be there day and night, the Red Cross and the Salvation Army. Local restaurants prepared food for the rescuers. Companies donated tools, buckets, generators, lights, even porta potties. Clergy members would ask, "How you really doing?" We brushed them off with a fine, but the truth is none of us was anywhere near fine. What we had witnessed and dug through had changed our lives. Some allowed their emotions to show. I chose to lock my emotions inside and became numb. All of us continue to fight a private war about 9/11. Lower Manhattan was isolated from the rest of the city, and people would yell for us to keep searching. I felt like Ground Zero was a holy ground. Unknown to us, many of the victims were being cremated by the fires raging underneath the rubble pile. Knowing you are literally on the graves of thousands of people is unnerving. As we worked late into our last night, we walked off the pile exhausted and hungry. We had not left Ground Zero from the moment we arrived, and it was time to find a restaurant and actually sit down at a table. We found a small restaurant and sat down and debriefed. Here we discussed some of our feelings, the great feeling of loss, sadness, and anger. We talked and expressed every one of our emotions to each other. Then just a few hours later, the caravan loaded back up. We signed the flag dedicated to the FDNY and slowly drove towards the George Washington Bridge. To our surprise, the streets were lined with people who cheered us the entire way. They thanked us and waved American flags. It was humbling to think in their pain they were thanking us. I left New York with a new sense of purpose, totally drained emotionally and physically, and I also left with overwhelming pride in my profession and extremely proud to be an American. Thank you for remembering the victims of September 11th.
Thank you, Captain Schneidman. I don't know how you manage to do this every year. very emotional just watching it, and you were there, and you worked on it, and it has to be an unbelievable feeling of pride, and as you said, in your profession, you should be very proud. I'd like to note that State Representative Michelle Mussman is also here. Michelle? Now I'd like to bring forward Police Lieutenant Darren Felgenhauer. Darren?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, Village Board, Village Commission. Thank you for allowing me to address you on this 18th anniversary of the worst terrorist attack in the U.S. soil in our history. My name is Lieutenant Darren Felgenhauer of the Hoffman Estates Police Department. I'm also a veteran of the United States Marine Corps, having served for 4 years. I've been with the Village of Hoffman Estates now for 22 years. Everyone remembers what they were doing or where they were on September 11th in 2001, when they first received news of the terrorist attacks. On that day, we witnessed acts of heroism from first responders, military members, and civilians. All first responders, military members, and government officials swear an oath and make a promise that we will protect and defend our country, state, and community in the duties that every first responder in America has promised if ever we are called into action. On September 11th in 2001, we witnessed this dedication to the communities we serve. Why do we choose to remember 9/11? As a first responder, it is extremely important for us to remember 9/11. Even though these attacks occurred over 800 miles away, they had an impact on every community throughout the United States. 19 terrorists conducted these attacks, which took the lives of 2,977 people. It is important for us to remember that no matter the danger we faced, we have promised to help and protect the people that we serve. A little over 400 first responders lost their lives that day attempting to save as many civilians as they possibly could. 18 years later, we're still losing first responders that answered the call during these terrorist attacks. Their mission at that time was of a reactive nature. 9/11-2001 was a display of how our profession reacts. In the years following 9/11, we started to see more of a proactive approach. Each community began to identify and look for potential future targets. We've hardened our vulnerabilities, and we've increased our oversight. In addition, on a national level, law enforcement has, as well as the intelligence agencies, have better lines of communication and share information in real time. As first responders, we run towards the sound of gunfire and into burning buildings. One of the most encouraging events that I took out of September 11th and those attacks was the reaction of the passengers and crew on board Flight 93. Normal, everyday citizens made a huge impact with limited information and in a very short period of time. Once they were able to determine that several other hijacked planes had been used as weapons, they resolved to fight. It is important for our community to understand that the government and our police will do all that is in our power to prevent another attack. However, it is each citizen that can make a difference. By staying vigilant, reporting suspicious behavior of a future attack may just be prevented. This is what embodies the Department of Homeland Security's campaign of see something, say something. Earlier I asked, why do we remember? We remember so that we honor those who have sacrificed to help others. We remember in order to stay vigilant against future attacks. Now, I grew up on the East Coast, and as a teenager, I was able to visit New York City, and I stood on top of the Twin Towers when you had the ability to do so. They were an impressive monument to America. In 2014, I had the opportunity to revisit New York, and I visited the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. I was also able to go up into Freedom Tower. Visiting these locations reminded me that as Americans, this event brought us closer and stronger. Terrorist organizations underestimate the results of their attacks in the United States. Our country was forged by the determination of a citizenry to literally fight for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When confronted by individuals and organizations that threaten our foundation, we as a community and nation will come together, despite any differences, and resist those who threaten our freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you for your wise words, Lieutenant Felgenhauer. This time I'd like to present firefighter paramedic Chris Kunder. Where's Chris? There he is. Part of the honor guard, as was Darren.
I was 12 years old on 9/11. I remember sitting in homeroom in my middle school. An announcement came over the PA instructing our teachers not to turn on the TVs. We all knew something was going on, but we had no idea what it was. It wasn't until later that day, in social studies, our teacher had been given the task to explain to students what had happened. I look back now and think of how daunting and impossible a task that must have been. He described the events that had taken place and fielded endless questions from confused and terrified seventh graders. That day, I returned home. I found my mom sitting on the couch crying as she watched the endless news coverage of what had happened. It was then, for the first time, I saw the dramatic events that had happened that day. It was difficult to comprehend. I had never heard of the World Trade Center. I didn't know what terrorism was. And I could not comprehend why something so evil would happen. It was that day that the innocence of my generation was ripped away as we were forced to see for the first time how dark and truly terrible the world can be. Over the next few years, we watched as our country went to war. I remember watching coverage of the battles being fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. In my junior year of high school, I began to feel a desire to do my part. The entire year, I spent more time researching the various jobs and branches of the military than my actual schoolwork. I made my choice. I was going to enlist in the Army's elite airborne units as an airborne infantryman. The summer between my junior and senior year of high school, I signed my contract. After my high school graduation, I would be leaving for basic training. The next year flew by as I coasted through my remaining classes, doing the bare minimum required of me in school. 3 days after I graduated high school, I was on a plane for Fort Benning, Georgia. This is where the Army conducts all its basic training for its combat troops. I remember that night being driven to the base by a bus. There was a lightning storm over the base. It all had seemed very foreboding at the time. It was then that the magnitude of my decision had finally set in. Our training consisted of marksmanship, combat tactics, first aid, and much more. The training was difficult, but we pushed each other to be better. The hardest thing was being away from home. I was 18 years old, and it was my first time being away from home. It felt like I was in a whole other world. After 4 months of training to be an infantryman, we graduated, and those of us who volunteered for Airborne headed down the street to Airborne School. Airborne school is an easy 3 weeks if you can get over the fact you're jumping out of a plane at 800 feet and hitting the ground at 20 feet a second. After completing airborne school, I was finally assigned to the 173rd Airborne Brigade in Germany, which is ironic as one of the classes I blew off in high school was German. We spent the next year and a half training to deploy. We would spend weeks and sometimes months in the field training. The men in my platoon quickly became my family. In some ways, we were closer with each other than our own families. We lived together, ate together, drank together, and eventually we fought together. That fall, our fate was set. Our leadership received orders that we'd be deploying to Afghanistan at the end of November of 2009. We packed all our things and prepared to go. We deployed in phases, with everyone leaving on different nights. The night my group left, I remember walking to our motor pool where we were to board buses to head to the airport. I had my rifle and my bag. I walked alone as we all left at different times. As I walked, I was filled with a sense of fear, anxiety, and excitement. As I approached the staging area, my head was filled with all the what-ifs that could possibly happen over the next year. I looked upon the faces of others, and I could tell their heads were filled with the same fears. As our group gathered, we stood around laughing, joking, and making fun of each other. It helped us cope with what was to come next. We supported each other. Our first night, we stayed at Bagram Air Force Base. A few of the older guys in our platoon noticed how on edge many of us younger guys were. They said, "Don't worry, nothing ever happens in Bagram." That night, the base was hit by several rockets launched by the Taliban. An ironic start. We were assigned to Logar Province, which is a province south of Kabul on the eastern border of Afghanistan. Our company conducted combat and security operations. We also conducted numerous public relations missions. Our officers would talk with village elders to figure out what we could do to help their village, while we passed out candy and toys to local children. We did the best we could to build a rapport with the locals and show them that we were only trying to help. We filled our time playing board games, cards, and playing pranks on each other. We fought together, we laughed together, and we survived together. We were more than friends, we were brothers. After our 12-month deployment, we returned to Germany. As the Army tried to readjust us back to normal society, I was studying for my promotional interview. My leaders had seen fit to promote me to sergeant. I passed my interview and was promoted to sergeant a few months later. At 22 years old, I was responsible for training, mentoring, and preparing young soldiers to deploy themselves. I never got a chance to lead the men that I trained on their deployment due to my contract ending. I like to think that the training and advice I bestowed upon them helped prepare them for their own success. As I left the Army, I left with a plan. I knew what I wanted to do. The fire service called to me in much the same way that the Army did. An opportunity to help others and to be a part of something greater than myself. After years of training in school, I was hired here as a Hoffman Estates firefighter paramedic in 2016. While there are numerous differences between the fire service and the military, it's the similarities that are important. The professionalism, the willingness to help others in spite of oneself, and the sense of community that binds us all together. Today we look back at 9/11 and remember and talk about how it's changed our lives. Today I look back and I feel hope. Hope from the heroic actions that day from fire, police, EMS, and bystanders as they sacrificed themselves to save others. Hope in how our country set aside political, racial, and religious differences to come together as Americans and support each other. And hope in how the men and women have sacrificed everything to fight for what is right and build a better future. Thank you for having me here today, and thank you for all you do to instill hope in our community.
Thank you, firefighter paramedic Hunder. It's now my opportunity to introduce someone who the village people all know, recently retired village employee, to give his recollections of 9/11 and do the closing prayer. Pastor Bruce Anderson, come on up.
Good evening. It's very unusual to be on this side of the camera for a change. You have heard from some of our first responders about where they were and what went on with them on 9/11, and I'd like to share my experiences. I was in Miami, Florida for a telecommunications conference on 9/11. I was on the board of directors of NATO and on the conference committee and getting ready to start the day. And as usual, I turned on the news and took a shower, and as I was getting out, they were showing the images of the first plane hitting the first tower in New York. I finished getting ready in a bit of a state of shock and went down the hallway to meet with some of my coworkers. And they asked, "Did you see it?" I said, "Yes, over and over again." "Yes, but did you see the second one?" In the time from when I'd left my room to go down the hall, the second airliner had hit the second tower. We talked about what we would do. We had 600 people, telecommunications people from around the country there. And I always found it somewhat ironic that the people who had put together municipal emergency telecommunications plans were not there that day to put them in place. We decided that we would keep going as best we could with the conference, since it would be difficult for people to get home and they would need something to do. My task that day was to find some clergy and counselors to come in and talk to people who were there, to be able to go over their feelings and their experiences. And so I called around to various churches and counseling areas, and for some reason, all the pastors and counselors were busy that day. I can't imagine why. So I volunteered to sit and talk with people. They gave me a room, and some of my fellows came in from different times during the day and talked about friends and family that had worked or lived in that area and their fears of what might have happened. And as I had not been able to find any clergy, the president of the organization came and asked if I might be willing to lead a prayer service that evening. Well, at the time, I was no more a clergy person than any of you. Hadn't really thought about being a clergy person, but I said that I'd give it a try and went back to the room and dug the Gideon's Bible out of the bedstand. And thanked God for the Gideons. Just struggling with what I would do that evening, I turned to the concordance in the back and looked up the words that were going through my head and the emotions that the people who had talked to me that day had expressed. Fear, anger, despair. And looked through the Psalms and found the Psalms that spoke to those conditions, and spoke to 150 of my fellow conference goers that evening, and read some of the Psalms and gave them an opportunity to speak to their concerns and their fears that night. And after we finished up, I shook hands with some of the people, and a few of them said, "I never knew that you were a minister." And I said, "Well, I'm not." They're like, "Well, I think you'd be a good one." So I consider that the first step toward the ministry. And a few other things happened in the years following that confirmed what I had heard and led me to enroll in seminary. And I was blessed to work for a village that was willing to work with me so that I could fit in classes during various times of the day if I had a a morning class, they would let me flex my schedule to fit that in, or an afternoon class. It took me 9 years to finish seminary, but I was able to do it with the support of the village, for which I am eternally grateful. So a lot of people affected on that day. And it took days and days of going to the airport there in Miami before I was finally able to get a flight out to return home to my family. So now I'd like to finish our remembrance today with a word of prayer. Would you please bow your heads and join me? Lord, as we remember the victims of 9/11, I ask that you would help us to remember as well those who have died since and those that still suffer as a result of that terrible day. Help us to remember the lives of the first responders who every day put their lives on the line to preserve our safety and security here at home, going into danger to help those in need as we try to go the other way. Help us also to remember the military personnel who also risk their lives at home and abroad to protect our freedoms and liberty here in the United States. May they also serve to protect the freedoms and liberty of all people in all nations justly. And Lord, I pray that you will help us who claim to be your followers to live and act according to your example and your will, so that others can glimpse your love through us. Forgive us when we seek to make you small enough to be safe and understandable rather than challenging. As you have created us in your image, all too often we seek to try to recreate you in our image, as one who loves who and what we love, and hate who and what we hate. Help us to see all of our neighbors through the eyes of love and compassion and forgiveness that you have for us all. Help us to overcome the fear and hatred of our nationalism, tribalism, and selfishness, so that we can reach out to serve the poor and oppressed, the least, the last, and the lost, as you did, and as you ask us to do. We know you as a God of forgiveness, mercy, justice, inclusion, and love. Help us to also act in these ways so that our lives may bring honor and glory to you. Lead us ever anew in the strength of your Spirit to be the people you created us to be, living according to your perfect will and example. And I pray that you will bless the labor of our government workers as they seek to provide for the everyday needs of our residents here in the village, here in the state of Illinois, and in all the countries of the world, especially these United States of America, so that we may once again shine forth as your light on the hill for the world, living as the people of your new Jerusalem. And I pray that you will help us to come back together as one, as we did after those days of 9/11, acting in unity and purpose for the good of our neighbors and all those who are in need. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor Anderson. I'd like to thank the Celebrations Committee and its chairperson, Bev Romanoff, for holding this event every year. I'd like to thank the Fire and Police Honor Guard for presenting the colors. I'd like to thank Captain Schneidwin for once again making his very moving presentation. And I want to thank the Schneidwin family for being here, along with John. I'd like to thank Lieutenant Darren Felgenhauer, firefighter paramedic Chip Chris Kunder, and Pastor Bruce Anderson. It's good to see you back in Village Hall, Pastor. And we do have some light refreshments will be available, and We hope to see you all here on September 11th, 2020, because we will do this again next year. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your coming.